नमस्कार। British colonial policy toward native states, century 1858 to 1914 AD. In October 1906, the governor of Bombay, Lord Lamington, urged the new viceroy, Lord Minto, to initiate a policy of relieving them the princes from so much government supervision and interference. Minto needed little encouragement, resenting the aggressive and dictatorial behavior of his predecessors, Lord Curzon, towards the states, and a year later he informed John Morley, the Secretary of State, that Sindhi of Gwalior had declared the tyranny of Curzon's rule towards the native chiefs had been so unbearable that nothing would have induced them to put up with it, and that they would have united together without regard to religion or caste to throw it off. With the appointment of Harcourt Butler at the head of the Foreign Department in 1908, Curzon's idea was officially discarded and replaced by a policy of non-interference in state affairs. Various factors had led to the adoption of such a policy. It had been deemed necessary to reduce the demands made of the overworked and understaffed Foreign Department, and after much open resentment on the part of their rulers, to relieve them of the constant overseeing of their private affairs, examples of which are evident in the chapters on education, marriage, and hierarchy and ritual. In addition, the viceroy believed strongly that given the home government's determination to introduce constitutional reform in the provinces in order to appease critics of the Raj, he was morally bound to grant a corresponding concession to its most faithful allies. Minto and Butler were persuaded by an argument put forward by the Gaikwad in 1909 that a looser leash on the princes would improve rather than retard the standard of their administrations. Overall, however, the policy was designed to ensure that the princes would act to support the British position in India. Confronted with the rise of extreme nationalism following Curzon's partition of Bengal in 1995, Minto and Butler reached the conclusion that Indian rulers could be both capable and willing alliance partners. At the beginning of the discussions which led to the Indian Council Act of 1909, Minto suggested that a council of princes might serve as a possible counterpoise to the Indian National Congress, the vehicle for the nationalist movement. John Morley, the Secretary of State, doubted the vision of the suggestion on the grounds that if the princes were allowed to combine and confer, they might conceivably use the opportunity to unite against the government. However, although Minto failed to secure constitutional recognition for the princes, he was determined that his viceroyalty would not leave them empty-handed. In a speech at Udaipur in November 1909, he unveiled the principles of the new non-interference policy, declaring, "I have always been opposed to anything like pressure on Darbars. With a view to reintroducing British methods of administration, I have preferred that reforms should emanate from the Darbars themselves and grow up in harmony with the traditions of the state." It is easy to overestimate the value of administrative efficiency. It is not the only object to emit, although the encouragement of it must be attractive to keen and able political officials, and it is not unnatural that the temptation to further it should be, for example, appeal strongly to those who are temporarily in charge of the administration of state during a minority, whether they are in sole charge or associated with the state council. Their position is a difficult one. It is one of the peculiar trusts, and all the abuses and corruption must, of course, as far as possible, be corrected. I cannot but think that political officials will do wisely to accept the general system of administration to which the chief and his people have been accustomed. The methods sanctioned by tradition in states are usually well adapted to the needs and relations of the ruler and his people. The loyalty of the latter to the former is generally a personal loyalty, which administrative efficiency, if carried out on lines unsuited to local traditions, would lessen or impair. The Udaipur speech makes it clear that Minto is well aware of the fact that, as has been set out in this thesis the value of administrative efficiency, by which keen and able political officers set such store had frequently undermined the traditional basis of rule in the Indian state time, totally disregarding the needs and relations of the ruler and thereby undermining his status by his subjects. The precise details of the new policy were formulated by Butler in the Political Department Manual, in stark contrast to the policy of Sir Curzon. The political officer was now given strict instruction that he was not to interfere in the domestic affairs of the princess unless misrule was rampant. Paragraph 6 of the introduction to the manual insists that he should leave well alone. The best work of a political officer is most what he has left undone, having guaranteed internal independence to the states and having undertaken their protection against external aggression. The imperial government have assumed some responsibility for the maintenance of order and fairly efficient government of them, and cannot consent to them being an indirect instrument of oppression. The degree of misrule which will call for interference is a question for decision on the merits in each case. It may be stated generally that unless misrule reaches a pitch which violates the elementary laws of a civilization, the imperial government will usually prefer to take no overt measures for enforcing reform, and in any case the attempt to reform should, so long as is possible, be confined to personal suasion. The pre-appraisal of government policy towards the states during Minto's viceroyalty was accompanied by an equally significant development among the princely ranks. A new type of prince, Anglicized in outlook and social habits, began to emerge. The Curzon's administration had done much to stimulate this development in attempting to foster a new sense of responsibility among the princes. Curzon was largely responsible for dismantling the traditional barriers of isolation which had prevented a prince from looking back beyond the narrow confines of his own state. As has been discussed in different chapters of this thesis, British influence, particularly in the area of education, had produced westernized princes such as Jai Singh, Maharaja of Alwar, and Ganga Singh and Maharaja of Bikaner, both products of Mayo College. However, these men were not representative of the princely orders as a whole, and the transition was not always wholly or successful. A prince could become both prince physically or culturally estranged from his subjects, and endangering the traditional respect for authority, which was still seen to validate the existence of the princely regime. Such estrangement was not inevitable in a few isolated cases, as Manu Bhagwan has suggested, by bridging the gap between the colonial and the colonized princes and their bureaucracies could use modern ideas successfully to provide moral example of states bearing one that they could claim to be loyal representatives of the imperial, and bearing the other the last line of defense, protecting the Indian people from the full onslaught of English civil evil. The packages of reform pursued by the administrations of Krishna Raja Wadiyar of Mysore and Sayaji Rao Gaikwad of Baroda during the first 3 decades of the 20th century were warmly received by their people, who expressed their general contentment by rejecting frequent calls for agitation against their governments. However, for many princes less ambitious in their outlook, the methods sanctioned by tradition to which Minto referred at Udaipur were no longer an option either in internal state government or palace life. In December 1950, Sindhya Maharaja of Gwalior described the irreversible situation created by the loss of his traditional role, forming the viceroy Lord Harding that all the political officials had used minority periods to remove long-standing abuses and improve the finances of the state. Their methods had shaken the adherence of the people to their traditional customs and ways. He considered that minorities had worked to alter the ties of personal loyalty and obedience between the subjects and their prince. When the latter entered upon his inheritance, it had the possibility for a political partnership. Increased relationship between the British and the princes came to be characterized more by consultation than control of subordinate by superior, particularly after the establishment of the Chamber of Princes in 1921, which allowed rulers direct access to the Delhi authorities. Eminent among the Those rulers who played a prominent role in institutions such as Chamber of Princes and the Committee of Ministers were Ganga Singh of Bikaner, Uday Bhan Singh of Jodhpur, Digvijay Singh of Navan, Navanagar, Bhupinder Singh of Patiala, Sultan Jahan Begum and Nawab Hamidullah Bhopal. However, it must be stated that dazzling status achieved by these rulers on the All India stage was unable to hide the fact that in most cases, in their own states, the traditional power base of the princely rank had been severely diminished by the lack of British support during the last decades of the previous century. Ian Copeland suggests that the princes failed to maximize their domestic political advantages in advance of the British departure from India in 1947 by formally incorporating light sections of their own people, particularly the great growing commercial and professional middle class, into the local Darbari system. The insistence placed by British officials on the employment of highly credentialed outsiders in the form of the Diwans and senior bureaucrats, increasingly playing a more significant role in the state administration than a prince himself, might not have been in the long term a good policy. As foreigners, they were often unpopular with the people, and as mercenaries, their primary loyalty was to their paymasters. The rulers might have fared better in the documents of 1947 to 1948 if they had opted for less distinguished but more patriotic servants with roots in the regions. James Manner viewed the main implementation of laissez-faire policy towards the states as the major factor determining the downfall of the princes. Other historians agree that commitment to the minimum of interference from the imperial government went far towards preventing the introduction of internally forbidding the states, and unreformed they stood little chance of positive participation in a new democratic India. Barbara Ramusak states that the adoption of an imperial laissez-faire policy towards the states in 1909 marked a point beyond which virtually nothing was done to secure the political future of the rulers. Stephen Aston considers that the introduction of the policy was a landmark, and the principles underlying it stood in marked contrast to the principles underlying the policies pursued during the 19th century. And Ian Copeland expresses the view that during the 30 years from 1909 to 1939, the British did not do nearly enough to ready their alliance for the time when they would have to stand on their own feet without the support of imperial patronage. Yet this thesis makes it clear that during the later part of the 19th century, although considerable effort was expended by the British to regulate Valley's life and by exposing young heirs to the Gaddi to Western liberal thought, to lay the groundwork for a modern monarchy, British laissez-faire approach to the princes already existed. When it came to matters of government, adult rulers were to a great extent left to their own devices by the paramount power. Reforms could emanate from other parts themselves, but such reforms tended to emanate from an administrative supervised by a competent Diwan and his bureaucracy, and not an Indian prince. During the period, the British had high hopes that the stereotype of the Oriental despot could be raised, replacing it by the model of a ruler embodying the virtues of rectitude and clean living and overseeing a physically circumspect government intent upon the improvement of the moral and social welfare of its people. There was little delicacy on the part of British officials when it came to undermining traditional princely practice. For political officials in particular, the ends were seen to justify the means in a rigorous determination to produce order where there was chaos, as demonstrated below. Such determination is evident in every stage of the princely life cycle. However, in the most important stage for the rulers, the one in which he was intended to rule, the British pursuit of order undoubtedly reduced the traditional authority of an Indian prince to the greatest extent without providing him with the support to recreate his role in a modern mold, which despite the granting of adoption sanads by Canning in an effort to maintain princely loyalty, the British still retained the ultimate sanction of royal successions in the Indian states. If a prospective heir was deemed unfit to rule for any region, or if a succession was unclear, the government of India showed little hesitation in alighting upon a candidate who showed a readiness to adopt modern methods of rule. To instill such a progressive attitude, the British were rigorous in their daily dedication to princely education, if not wholly successful in achieving the desired results. The British attempt to regulate royal marriage and to improve the moral tone of palace life was to a great extent to ensure that a dissolute environment did not dissipate their efforts on the princely educational front. In some cases, their campaign against what they perceived as ignorance, prejudice, and superstition was furthered by the presence of powerful royal women who subscribed to British ideas. As far as royal rituals were concerned, ceremony was now bound by rules and regulations, and traditional royal liturgy was curtailed by several economic restrictions. The subordination of the Indian princess to British imperial rule was constantly emphasized in subtle and less subtle ways in their position was established in the imperial hierarchy. Finally, the British obsession with the efficiency and accountability in the realm of administration resulted in adult princes being deprived of the opportunity to act as an essential cog in the wheel of a sound modernized government. The word puppet-like has frequently been used to describe the Indian rulers during the period, yet there is little proof that the British set out deliberately to manufacture puppet rulers. Why should the paramount power have devoted so much time and energy towards civilizing young princes if they were intended merely to act as safeguards, as figureheads? The problem lay in the fact that the regulations and economic measures required to produce well-ordered and open government were on the whole alien concepts to the first generation of Indian westernized rulers attempting to integrate a relatively untrained and often unwilling ruler into the administrative procedures was frequently more trouble than it was worth, particularly with the endless round of negotiation required between the various parties involved in state politics. As far as individual rule was concerned, the British laissez-faire policy towards the princes had begun decades before the Minto Declaration. These decades were by no means the golden age that Metcalfe described. Additionally, the protectors and sustainers of the social fabric, the status of the Indian princes had been dramatically diminished by the process of enforcing in their administration the virtues of cleanliness, certainty, promptitude, and cheapness, advocated so enthusiastically by James Mill. As Butler recognized in the private and secret handling over note he wrote to his successor, the indigenous system of government is a successor in 1910. As Butler recognized in the private and secret handling over note he wrote to his successor in 1910, the indigenous system of government is a loose despotic system tempered by corrupt, which does not press hard on the daily lives of the people and relies for its actions on occasional severe punishments of erring and offending individuals. Our system is a scientific system which presses steadily on the people in their daily lives, controls them, regulates their actions, attempts to prevent even through its orders of subordinates, makes itself everywhere felt that advancing native states generally adopt more upper methods because it is easy to get good men of their own school with modern training. But it would be a bold man who said that our system was always the better, and the power behind the throne makes it clear for the purpose of modeling aware in progressive rulers of India, the enforcement of rigorously ordered British system during the crucial phase of princely development at the end of the 19th century was by no means the better solution, rejecting the view that Britain built up her princely allies to retain their loyalty in the later part of the 19th century. This thesis comes to the conclusion that British indirect rule by commission or omission severely undermined the traditional role of the Indian prince in adding significantly to the understanding of the involvement of the British in princely India during the period. The work makes a strong contribution to research on imperialism under the Raj. Dhanyavad. Thank you so much. Bibliography. J. Duncan M. Derrick, Tradition and Law in India in J. R. Murray and Tradition, Politics in South Asia, New Delhi, 1979. Fisher, Michael H. The Imperial Coronation of 1819 over the British and the Mongols, Modern Nation Studies, 1985. Galtung Johan, A Structural Theory of Imperialism, Journal of Peace Research, 1991. Jordan Stewart, Legitimation and Loyalty in Some Successor States in J. F. Richards, Kingship and Authority in South Asia, Delhi, 1998. Hardiman, David, Baroda, The Structure of a Progressive State in Jeffrey People, Princeton. Bingal, Richard, Changing Attitude to the Indian States, 1820 to 1850, Study of Ud, Hyderabad and Jaipur in C. H. Phillips and M. Dorian Wainwright, Indian Society and Beginning of the Modernization Century, 1813 to 1850, London, 1976. Canadine, David, The Context, Performance and Meaning of Ritual, The British Monarchy and the Invention of Tradition, Century, 1820 to 1977, in E. Hobsbawm, T. Ranger edition, The Invention of Tradition, Cambridge, 1983. Ellen Charles, Lives of the Indian Princes, London, 1984. Apadurai Arjun, Worship and Conflict Under Colonial Rule, South Asian Case, Indian Case, Cambridge, 1981. Argyll, Duchess of Georgia, Douglas, 8th Duke of Argyll, 1823 to 1900. Autobiography and Marriage, 2 volumes, London, 1906. Argyll, Duke of India, under Dalhousie and Canning, London, 1865. Aston, Stephen R. British Policy Towards the Indian States, 1905 to 1939, London, 1982. Bailey F. Gillis, Strata, Gems and Spoils, New York, 1969. Balfour, Elizabeth, The History of Lord Lytton's Indian Administration, 1876 to 1880, London, 1899. Personal and Literary Letters of the Earl of Lytton, London, 1900. Bal Hatchet, Kenneth, Race 6 in Class Under the Raj, London, 1980. Virgin, Banerjee, Anil Chandra, The Rajput States and British Paramount in Delhi, 1980. Baroda, Maharaja of in Fuss, Virginia, The Palaces of India, London, 1980. Barton, Sir William, The Princes of India, London, 1934. धन्यवाद, thank you. Dori Soto, Paolo, Traditional Rule and Modern Conventions, The Maharaja of Bikaner and their relationship with the Raj, 1897-2040, PhD thesis, Royal Holloway College, University of London, 2001. Lambert, Harley, Shio Contesting Seclusion, The Political Emergence of Muslim Women in Bhopal, 1901-1913, PhD thesis, SOAS University, SOAS University of London, 1998. Men and We, Popular Princes, Kingship and Social Change in Cochin and Travancore, 1870-1930, PhD thesis, University of Oxford, 1998. धन्यवाद, thank you so much.